Dear friends, Elie Wiesel, who passed away in July 2016, was a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. He became a writer, a human rights activist, a voice of conscience, and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. We talked from time to time. If I asked him, what shall I say today, he would answer, begin at the beginning. Begin with your origins, where you come from. A person must know where they are from. I was born in The Hague, Holland on August 5th, 1940. 5 years later, in the spring of 1945, I was reunited with my parents after nearly 3 years in hiding. The survivors of a shattered world returned, telling their stories of horrors seen and experienced in such places as Auschwitz. What could a child, having been deprived of childhood or adolescence, say in light of the death camps? In any case, no one asked what it was like for us, so we children remained silent, as silent as when we had been in hiding. I turned 5 that summer, and by its end had already become the repository of stories no child should ever hear. And we grew up too quickly. We were, in fact, elderly children. My memory begins at age 2.5. I'm leaning against my father in a chair, learning not to call him Dad, but uncle as in a close family friend. I must not be able to betray him as my father. It had all escalated with a German order to report for resettlement in the East on August 19th, 1942. That's when we got our orders. They had heard nothing from friends who had already been resettled. None had returned. Only much later did they learn that reporting meant transfer to the transit camp Westerbork in northern Holland, and from there to Auschwitz or Sobibor. We fled the house, taking nothing with us, not even a photo album, especially a photo album. My desperate parents placed me with former neighbors, and through a series of miracles, I ended up in the home of Albert and Violetta Munnik and their 12-year-old daughter, Nora. When my father visited, I was already settled in with the Munniks, becoming Robbie Munnik. And for nearly 3 years, they risked their lives because it was the right thing to do. I knew something was wrong. I was warned to stay away from the front window. There were Dutch Nazis living across the street, and I certainly absorbed a sense of danger, especially when Nora took me out in a buggy. She was 10 years older than I, so she was a 12-year-old with a 2-year-old coming into her house. Around about this time, she was 13. That event was so unusual that I remember it vividly. I must have been about 3 to 3.5 years old. We reached a viaduct that was partly flooded. A German soldier walked over and helped Nora carry the buggy past the water. I had buried myself under the blanket. Years later, I asked Nora, where were we going? She said she had decided to take me to see my mother because little children should see their mothers. Did we get there? I asked, for I remembered no further than the German soldier. She said we did, and that the SS came that day to search my mother's little apartment. We hid under the bed, and my mother succeeded to turn them away. She had false papers. To this day, I do not know how Nora knew where my mother was hiding. She doesn't talk about it. In fact, when I reminded her of the entire buggy episode, she at first denied it happened at all and insisted that my memory was wrong. Jongetje, she said, little boy, who was smarter, me, who was older, me, who knew more, who remembers more. She fought my memory and I fought for it. But she had good reason to forget. Nora had endangered us all. But other than that lapse, she was a terrific older sister. She kept quiet at school and returned home to teach me how to read and write. And I was a good little brother, quiet, obedient, cooperative. I never complained. Somehow I knew I could not be taken out for illness, so I had no illnesses. And if I did not report them. And I did not cry. Never. Not until liberation. Then I protested having to leave the Munniks to return to my parents who had miraculously survived. The three of us made it. Everyone else had been murdered. My parents' parents, brothers and sisters. I grew up without grandparents, aunts or uncles. In 1945, we knew very little. We soon learned. Of 140,000 Dutch Jews, over 80% had been murdered. From a total of 108,000 Dutch Jews deported via Westerbork to Auschwitz and Sobibor, 3,500 returned. I did not yet know I was a Jew. In fact, my first year of school was in a Catholic kindergarten, where I was the Mother Superior's prize pupil, or perhaps most promising potential convert. Remaining in Holland was too depressing. We came to Canada in 1951 on the Diemerdijk, a freighter with passenger accommodation, 5 weeks via the Panama Canal. I was the world's most eager immigrant. The moment we got to Vancouver, I knew I had it made. Within a month, we bought a small house. I started school, delivered newspapers, and mowed lawns. By summer, I had friends, pocket money, and I was on my way. What a country. It was tough on my parents. A new start, their third or fourth. A new language, their third or fourth. They struggled. I thrived. We were immigrants. No one greeted us. There were no ESL classes. We learned English from going to movies and never spoke Dutch again at home. Our real estate salesman had shown us Vancouver. As part of his tour, we visited the British properties in West Vancouver. He said, Jews and Chinese are not allowed to buy homes here. I was placed in grade 4 rather than grade 5 for not knowing English in that spring of 1951. Having learned the language over the summer, I returned to start grade 6. It was not allowed. Later, I made up my lost year by skipping grade 11. How did I handle being an immigrant with a pronounced accent? Despite being very shy, I was soon on stage playing the role of Franz Schubert. They needed a kid with an accent who could play the piano. And within another few weeks, I was in spelling bees, and on the soccer team, I fought to be normal. By 1961, I picked 1961 specifically, we all knew the word genocide, coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, had been seared into the hearts and minds of those who recognized that the Holocaust had been a genocidal assault on the existence of the Jewish people, and that in Europe it had been a near success. Only a few months more of war, and the likelihood that any witnesses would have remained to testify as to the actual death camps were slim. How does the world look to the accidental survivor of genocide? I say and use the word accidental simply because a child's survival was largely a matter of luck. When 100,000 Dutch Nazis were looking for Jews to betray, what are the odds of not being found? In total, perhaps 50 to 100 people knew of me being with the Munniks. If one had told the wrong person, it was over. It was over for Anne Frank and her family. It was in 1961 that I returned to Holland for my first visit since our immigration. I knocked on the door, so excited to see my mother. The next door neighbor opened his door. Robbie, is it you? Yes, meneer de Vries. Here to see your mother, of course I am. You know, he continued, I'm somewhat disappointed in you. Why is that? You never thanked me for not betraying you. I believe that to genocide survivors, the world looks distorted, deformed, wounded. We no longer view it as do those whose lives unfolded more or less normally. This does not mean lives untouched by tragedy. It is part of living life to encounter personal tragedy, illness, problems, obstacles, challenges. But whereas one may have to deal with a loss, or an unexpectedly deeply traumatic event, within the framework of genocide, the events are overwhelming. And even worse, they make no sense. They are bereft of meaning. What, after all, is the meaning of nearly 1 million murders in Rwanda within the span of 100 days, a rate of 10,000 deaths a day? What was the meaning of the murders of 1.5 million Jewish children in a manner so brutal that although I know some of the details, I cannot bring myself to speak of it? Only 7% of all Jewish children in Nazi-occupied territory survived. They could not grasp what had happened. Many pushed it away. Then memory returned. As a participant in a forum on children and genocide, I had the privilege of hearing His Excellency Richard Sezibera, MD, Ambassador of Rwanda to the USA, and he stated, "Memory is the highest and perhaps the most meaningful tribute one can pay to the victims of genocide. Those who commit genocide do not only intend to kill, but to erase their victims from the collective memory of the world. Our memories, our insistence on memory, while not having succeeded to stop contemporary genocidal efforts, have nevertheless made it more difficult for the killers to kill. I've often wondered whether Auschwitz-Birkenau would have been so effective a killing site had it attracted the kind of attention from journalists and the internet that is possible today." So now you know a little of my preoccupations. They never go away. Which brings us to this day. What are we facing? The news is filled with worrisome signs and trends. A new US president tweets recklessly. Protesters at liberal universities invited speakers from actually speaking. Women march, men march, and children are witness to leaders acting rudely and irresponsibly. Political correctness dampens normal and necessary discourse. We can no longer offer opinions. It may offend someone. My antennae as a Jew are on high alert, for Jew hatred has reemerged. In Europe, there is a new generation of grandchildren who have rediscovered what their grandparents did. Some are battling the new hatred. Others are fanning the flames. My antennae as a Canadian are on high alert as well. What are our students learning? Our campuses are hotbeds of intolerance, it seems, more from the left than the right. In the USA, new generations have entirely forgotten the Holocaust. And the ideas of Marx and Lenin have now found new favor in US colleges. Ayan Hirsi Ali, a Muslim woman who has suffered the indignities of the extremes of her faith, had her lecture invitation at a liberal university rescinded. Her efforts to inform students of her struggle against intolerance were labeled hate speech. What can anyone say when even one person or several can shut you down with a claim of hurt feelings? And often it is only what they think they heard and is totally misinterpreted. How shall we have a meaningful conversation in our community and in our country? Here in Vancouver, one preoccupation is housing and who drives prices. Is it entirely foreign investment? What about the influx of immigrants to our area who require housing? Is it wise to create a metropolitan area where the two dominant languages appear to be English and Chinese? Does that help Chinese immigrants to adapt to Canada or isolate them from other Canadians? What of resurgent anti-Semitism? The recent discovery of some 2014 footage reveals Imam Syed al-Gitawi delivering a sermon during which he asks Allah, in quotes, this is in front of his congregation, to destroy the accursed Jews and to make their children orphans, their women widows. The sermon was videotaped at the Al-Andalus Islamic Center in Montreal. In 2016, the UN General Assembly adopted 18 resolutions against Israel. The Security Council adopted 12 Israel-specific resolutions, more than all those focused on Syria, North Korea, Iran, and South Sudan together. We should know by now where anti-Semitism leads. It may begin with Jews, but it never stops with Jews. Hate breeds hate. That should also raise the question whether or not refugees carry some seeds of hatred taught in their countries of origin. Perhaps English is not the only skill that needs to be taught. So should tolerance and respect for other faiths, for women, for the LGBTQ community, for democracy, and for justice. We should know by now, but are reminded that we must relearn. Education is the word, and teach that people must not be judged by their race, color, ethnicity, or religion. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." If we don't do this, that could lead to despair, and we Jews are forbidden to despair. As David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the reborn state of Israel, said, "A Jew who does not believe in miracles is not a realist." So let's be realists, and while we struggle to make miracles, be kind to one another. That is where it all begins, for if we do not learn to love and respect one another, the lights will go out. I wish success to S.U.C.C.E.S.S in this great and necessary initiative that gathers us here today. Thank you.